Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted with Susan Smith.
Hello, my quilting friends, and welcome. I'm Susan, and you're in my studio, Stitched by Susan. This is a live and unscripted episode, so I'm going to be quilting a project for you today in real time, warts and all. Whatever happens, happens. You get to see all the things. Beside me, I have my sidekick, Stella. She's a Bernina Q24, and what you're seeing here is not typical on a Bernina, but it's the camera apparatus. You'll be seeing close-up shots later on. So that's what I get to maneuver around with my left hand while I quilt. But we'll be doing an edge-to-edge project from start to finish today. And yeah, it just gives you a chance to kind of look over my shoulder and see thought processes and even decisions as I'm making them. And I'm a chatter, so I just talk through those things as I'm doing them. So this is not a tutorial per se. Much less focus on the quilting design, much more focus on sort of the big picture idea of setting up and squaring up and completing a whole project. So this is interactive. You can type in your questions at any time. We do ask that you put a Q in front of them. As more and more people are finding this show, we're getting more and more comments, and so it helps to have that Q. Then we can search for questions and try not to miss any of them. So what I'll do is kind of pause it a couple of times, maybe between passes of the quilt to take more of the questions, and I promise I'll get to as many as I possibly can, and some I'll just answer while I'm quilting. So let me know if you have questions, comments, tips. I do not profess to know it all. If those of you who have been faithful watchers know that sometimes I get stumped too, and you all have been very forthcoming with your tips. So this truly is like a kind of old-fashioned quilting bee. There is a certain amount of exchange of ideas and tips. So I appreciate that. Feel free to chime in with them. Mr. Producer's interrupting me. Donna, is that a new coffee container? Okay, Donna, clearly you're a faithful watcher. See, here's the thing. I've been drinking way too much coffee, so I am endeavoring to drink more water. So, this is my water jug. Although, how do you know that what I say is true? It could be coffee in here. Anyway, trying to drink something healthy this morning. Yay for new habits. Okay, I was going to just slide into a few credits, a few people that I want to thank. First and foremost, my husband, Dave. We lovingly call him Mr. Producer. And he's, behind the scenes, he's got a desk full of wires and cables and routers and monitors and all the things that I don't want to deal with. So this is not a one-woman show. A huge thanks to him for helping me put these on. And by the way, he does have a day job, but he works in a church. And so he gets Friday and Saturday are his weekend. And so that works well for our Friday live and unscripted. So we do this as often as we can together. And I try to put them on about twice a month. Not always regularly scheduled, but they're always 9 a.m. Pacific time, and they're always Friday. So another thanks goes out to our son, Will, who did the credits. Was it Mr. Bond this morning, hon? Yeah, Mr. Bond voice this morning. He does all kinds of voice affectations, and I just love them. So that was him. Thanks to Will for that. And then lastly, but not least, our good friend Dan Unger, who provides the lovely guitar music that you'll hear throughout the show. It's so restful and peaceful. So many of you love it, and I do too. Sadly, it's not available for purchase, but thanks, Dan, for letting us use it. We appreciate it. Okay. This show is, of course, free because it's YouTube, but if you do want to support it, if you appreciate the tips that you find and you want to help us keep upgrading our cameras and our setup, you can do that easily at buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. There, for as little as $1, you can make either a one-time contribution. Sorry, I said $1 and I meant $5, the price of a decent coffee. You can make a one-time contribution, or if you wish, you can do a monthly commitment as well. Entirely up to you. Whatever you choose, we appreciate you being here, and we massively appreciate those of you who have supported. Every new camera, every new cable that we purchase comes from those funds, and that's where every dollar goes. So we appreciate that. Also, if you're looking for some easy listening while you quilt, I do have a podcast, and it's called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and Other Life Lessons Learned from Quilters. You can find that easily at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. And later this week, we are actually uploading those podcasts also into YouTube. So there will now be a playlist in YouTube for the podcast. So at this point, it's past episodes. that we're releasing on YouTube, and new episodes will be coming there as well as they get released. Okay, have I covered all those? I think so. If you love this style of casual, real-time, in-the-moment quilting, would you please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel? There will be lots more of these coming in the future. I'm all about quilting, and I'm all about helping novices get through the sort of paralyzing decisions. I still remember all those feelings. So hopefully, inviting you into my studio and letting you watch this will help you through those. So let's introduce today's project and we'll get started. I'm just stepping off camera to pick up my bits. Here's the backing. And I should mention one more thing. It's kind of an oddity. I usually load my quilts with the red snapper system, which means there's a rod inserted in the hem of my leader, and I lay my fabric over it and snap, snap, snap a little cover on top. Well, I do still have my old Gamma long arm, and for various reasons, I was using it this week. I'm interested in selling it, so people were wanting information and demos and what have you. So I've got my red snappers on there. And of course, I can take them off, but I thought this is a great opportunity for those of you who don't have red snappers or don't want to use them for hand strength reasons or whatever. It would be fun to see me doing it with pins because my same basic system still applies. So that's what I decided to do today. So what I've got is a straight edge facing me, and that is the one critical part. You'll see as I progress, I do not measure the center of the leader or the center of the quilt. I'm literally loading at the front, and you'll see how I make sure that it gets straight in a moment. But to begin with, what's important is that you have a straight edge facing you. So sometimes that is a selvage and sometimes not. In this case, it's not. This particular backing doesn't really have selvages on it. It's a pieced one. The quilt that we'll be working on is a charity one. It's for a local quilt guild, and they have a charity arm, and so it'll be a comfort quilt. It's not really a child's quilt, so probably it'll be a lap quilt, perhaps for someone in hospice or something like that. So all I'm doing is pinning to my leader, and I'm being careful, as I do with the red snappers, keep dropping pins, I'm being careful to neither stretch nor squish my fabric. I want to watch how it's laying so that it's smooth and evenly placed. And I certainly could drop pins every so often. I personally find it more convenient to just work my way across from one side to the other. And I'm going to change my pinning method. When I'm not on camera, I'm a bad girl and put pins in my mouth. I prefer to bunch the quilt up in my hand. So let me pick up the pins and try a different way. It is a magnetic bowl, so let's lay it on there. There we go. I prefer to have a bunch of this fabric in my left hand and then just go along kind of releasing it smooth and flat as I go. And I'm putting in my pins not quite nose to tail, and I'm taking a big inch-long stitch with each pin. So there's about 3 inches from center of pin to center of pin. And I'm using corsage pins, anything that is really sturdy. A typical sewing pin is definitely not robust enough to hold your quilt in place. They will bend all over the place on you. But corsage pins work quite nicely. But this is just kind of interesting because I often say there's no one right way to do a thing, and that is certainly true of loading quilts. Whether you use pins or red snappers or some type of magnet, any of those ways work. You find the way that works best for you. So once I've pinned this first straight edge, you'll see it does not actually matter if the rest of my backing is squared and with straight edges or not. And that is one of the beauties of loading this way. It's so quick because you don't have to take the time to center and you don't have to take the time to square up the backing of a quilt. I mean, some quilters do that for you, but a fair percentage of them do not. And that can be hard to do. But here's the critical next part. You now toss the remainder of the quilt backing over the rail. Okay? And then I'm going to walk around to the other side and smooth it out. And this is where it's important that you do get it straight. And I'll show you what I mean. If my quilt is pulled even a ½ inch to the right, can you see I start getting these diagonal pull lines telling me it is not on the straight of grain? So that's important that I get it smooth and straight over the rail, because what we're going to do next is just roll it on. And it will only roll straight, of course, if we have set it up to roll straight. So even the excess backing, if the quilt was bigger, I would make sure that it is hanging fairly straight off the machine as well. And sometimes you have to adjust that as you go. Some of you may wonder about the seam. It is running vertically. That was just a choice I made. If I have my druthers, I do run the seam horizontally. But in this case, I wanted to quilt with my quilt crossways. It will be more efficient. And this seam is pretty flat, so I opted to do a vertical seam. Again, there's not a right or wrong way for that. There's just the way that suits the quilt you're working on. So I'm just watching underneath to see when the edge of my backing comes to the edge of my leader. And then I'm going to walk around and pin the other side. And you can see this is all beautifully smooth along here. If it wasn't, I would have adjusted as I was rolling. What is important on this side when you're pinning is that you get your pins equally distant from the edge of the leader. Can this be seen on camera, Dave? At this edge. The reason is this leader is going to actually flip over, and the fabric's going to be folded over the pins, which you'll see as I roll it. On the front end, it didn't matter. It just stayed laying flat. But on this end, it actually does flip. So your pins need to be equidistant from the edge of the leader so that that flip is straight. So if some pins were a ½ inch in and some pins were an inch, that would not provide a nice flat backing, would it? So it doesn't matter what that measurement is. I'm doing about a ½ inch. I can feel the leader underneath, so I'm dropping my pins about a ½ inch from the edge. Those of you who watch regularly can see this is slower than red snappers. That's why I love the red snappers. But also, those of you who might be new or might still be doing loading with pins can see it's not all that slow, and it is still far, far faster than centering all the things, in my opinion. We're still going to be well under 10 minutes for the whole loading process, which is not too shabby. Five or six more pins and we'll have it made. So here again, you can see if there was any unevenness on the seams on the sides, if there was any unevenness in the length of my quilt on this end, I would literally just be letting that extend off the end. There is kind of a funny jog at this end, about a ½ inch, where there was, I don't know, the scissors didn't make a very smooth cut. And I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about that being a straight edge. I know that this has been pulled over the rail straight. So whatever little bit hangs off, doesn't matter. So now we'll finish rolling it. And just like that, we have a loaded back. And you can see it's smooth. It's flat. Every so often, for whatever reason, maybe the seam pulls up just a little too tight. If that's the case, and you know that it's loaded straight otherwise, an easy way to fix that is literally roll it all to the other end and then roll it back with a little bit of tension on both of the rollers, and that smooths out any slight unevenness that there might be. So let me grab the batting. I think it's big enough. I'm going to show you a little batting tip here. So I buy my batting in huge rolls. The batting is 120 inches wide. So this is actually the fold right here, and you're looking at 2 layers of it. I know that my quilt is 63 inches long, so I actually cut the entire width of batting, so that 120 inches, and I've got like 66 this way, knowing that I'm just going to use one end of it. So I'll undo this fold, and I'll do my one quilt, and I'll trim off after that quilt, and I'll have enough for a whole other lap quilt beside. Does that make sense? So if I had cut it the other way around, this is just more, saves more on the batting. I can often get 2 lap quilts side by side on my 120 inches. Instead of cutting, my quilt is 63 by, I think, maybe 50. So instead of cutting 50 inches, 120 inches wide, I cut 63. And I'm going to have one quilt over here and one quilt over here. Does that all make sense? I hope so. Mr. Producer's teasing me, my little air diagrams. Here's our sweet little quilt. Look at this. Isn't that cute? Bright and cheery sunflowers. So before I start basting it, I'm going to talk to you for just a minute about thread choice. This quilt is not super duper high contrast, but there are some darker and lighter areas. So I looked at several different threads. This paler one matches the yellow pretty exactly. This darker one matches the brown pretty exactly. And this gold doesn't match either of those fabrics, but there are shades of it in the sunflowers. This is my personal theory. If I use the lightest shade that matches a fabric, it will almost disappear in that fabric that it matches. And then it will contrast quite highly. If I had a little pool of it, I don't know if you can see it on camera, so I won't even bother pooling it. But that's how I test my thread. I pull off literally a yard or 2, and I move that pool around. If it almost disappears on this one, then it's apt to be very high contrast on the dark fabric. Conversely, if I take the thread that matches the dark one, it will almost disappear there, and it will show up quite distinctly on the lighter. So I choose to go kind of middle of the road when I'm quilting a whole quilt with one thread color. Occasionally my thread color isn't even in the quilt. I just pick one that plays well with all the colors and kind of shows up similarly across all the fabrics. I don't like that stoppy, starty look when it disappears in one and high contrast in the next one. So that's my choice, is this middle gold thread. That's what I'll be quilting with, and I've already got it loaded on the machine. So this is Isacord 100% polyester thread, and the color is 0721, if it matters to you. I do love the poly thread for its low lint qualities. I pretty much always quilt with polyester thread. I've used 80-20 Hobbs batting, so 80% cotton, 20% poly. It's a really great all-purpose batting. Nice loft, not too fluffy, a little fluffier than, say, Warm and Natural 100% cotton. Okay, apparently there's a few questions, and I'm thirsty, so why don't I get a sip of my healthy beverage and take a few questions. Someone's asking what my healthy beverage is. It's the Zip Fizz that Costco in our area sells. It's like a vitamin B fruits and vegetables kind of drink. Yeah. Teresa, I'm wondering if you discovered what or why your top thread kept breaking. So Teresa's referring to some earlier episodes, and there were several of them where I had chronic thread breaks. There were a few things, Teresa, but one of them that we discovered, I actually took my machine in for a full servicing start to finish, and the needle bar was slightly out of position. So that was the single largest thing that we discovered, and clearly that would make a difference. So it's been much better since then. Another Teresa, I'm a beginning long arm quilter. How long did it take you to get out of the beginner stage? Well, it's not so much a matter of time, Teresa, as how many quilts. I dove in and quilted like crazy. So in 7 years, I did 1,200 quilts, freehand, not with a computer. So it didn't take me very many months because I did a ton of quilts. I have a lot of friends who were willing to let me quilt on their stuff. So it just depends. Donna, do you center the quilt on your leaders? I do not. I don't, Donna. Nope. Lauren, thanks for the link to the ruler. What size do you use? So far, my favorite, Lauren, is approximately the 9-inch one. I don't have a picture, obviously, in front of me, but that's what I've had in the past and I'm familiar with. But with the new rulers that I'm now promoting, and I should stop and talk about them, I guess, for a second, although this episode doesn't have rulers, but I teamed up with Jamie Wallen of Quilter's Apothecary. I had a straight edge ruler. Actually, I can show you it. That's not it. No, I can't. I put it away already. Anyway, I have a ruler that's got a ruler plus a handle that I adore. And it's a yellow one, and I have mentioned it and given links to it for many months, and it's not available anymore. So I went looking for something similar. Well, turns out Jamie Wallen was the person who designed that ruler in the first place. So he now has on his website, which is Quilter's Apothecary, a whole line of them that have this same handle grip. So I still love this one. I think this one's 8 inches actually, because I'm so used to that size, but I did also get a shorter one and a much longer one. It's the handle that I love. So have we got it in the show description? I'm pretty sure I did put it in the description. If not, I'll add it after we get off air. The teaming up that we did means that you can use the code SBS10 for 10% off a collection of these rulers. So by collection, I mean you don't get 10% off anything in his shop. You just get 10% off the line of rulers that I'm promoting, if that makes sense. So shop, use the code SBS10. You'll be happy with that. So that was a little insert that has nothing to do with this quilt. Thanks for asking that question, Lauren. Getting me derailed. Cheryl, what is the benefit of floating the quilt top as opposed to pinning the top to the rail? For me, I think it's number one, speed, Cheryl, because I don't have to bother doing that other pinning. Secondly, it has to do with the fact that I like putting magnetic clamps on the front, which you'll see in a moment. I think that's faster than pinning or basting or even adjusting all the way through. And you kind of have to decide which way you're going to load, because if you're going to roll your top, then you have to use this roller here to roll up the quilt on, where I just go over this roller and roll my backing on the lower one, which you guys can't see. I just like floating the top. It's quick. I can control it. I can make adjustments as I need to go, and it has been effective for me, and I've done high-end show quilts and not had trouble with that, so it is my preferred method. But again, it's not one right way. Savannah, if I use pins, I have to take Band-Aid breaks. You know, sometimes that is true, and also pins are brutal for putting holes right across the stomach of your shirt. I have so many t-shirts that have little pinprick holes. It's terrible. Joyce, will the backing fabric run under the dead bar? It is under the dead bar. I didn't talk about it, but you saw that I had my leader kind of flipped over when I was loading that backing, and that's why, to orient that leader so that it now comes, it's flowing under the dead bar. Questions are coming. Rebecca, do you favor a certain side of the batting? Honestly, I don't for Hobbs 80/20. It does not have a scrim, and I don't worry about which side is up. I don't know if that's right or wrong or what they recommend, but I don't worry about it. Savannah, what pattern is that? It looks like a checkerboard with sunflowers. Neat. Honestly, I don't know. It looks like there's the big squares of sunflowers, which you now cannot see. Can we have the camera for half a sec? It looks like a big square of a sunflower, and then it looks like these were pieced, you know, brown and yellow, and then these were put on. So you get the corner looking. It is really, it's simple and very pretty, and there's just 3 fabrics in the whole quilt. Gina, I bought the red snapper system. The side clamps are almost impossible to open to insert fabric. Any suggestions? Yep, keep doing it. They break in like a good shoe. I had the same difficulty with mine, and they get easier and easier. So even sit when you're watching Netflix and open them 10 or 15 times. They will get easier. Maybe warm them with a blow dryer might help. Peggy, I have a question about your leftover batting. I'd love to see at a later date how you store your extra batting. Mine stacks up at times. I do label mine with the dimensions before storing it. I try to do that too, Peggy. When I've got a piece like this one that's going to be big enough for a quilt, I stick a little piece of paper with the measurements on it so I don't have to unfold it to see if it fits when I want to use it. Great tip. But I often have pieces that are not big enough for a whole quilt. And somewhere on my YouTube channel, I do have an episode about splicing batting, because I don't sew it and I don't use a fusible that you iron on. I do it right at the long arm in a pretty simple pretty darn effective way. So look up that episode on splicing batting if you want to know how I do that. Sally, where do you get the magnetic bars? They are simply from the hardware store, Sally. I got mine at Harbor Freight. That's a really common one in our area. They're the type that you would, in Canada, it might be Princess Auto, for example. It's not a high-end item at all. It's the type of thing that you would put tools on in your garage or maybe knives on in your kitchen. Yeah, super easy to find, generally. Okay, that's it for questions. Let's get started. Let's get stitching. So today I've got Bernina's number 9, I believe it is, hopper foot on here. It's not a ruler foot. It's a very fine foot, which is kind of fun. You can really see underneath it. Dave, I'm getting resistance on the cables there. Do I need to move the quilt? Or is it going to be okay? Like that's as far as I have to go. We're just checking our camera cables here a moment. That's it right there. Sorry about that. We're just, as you can imagine, we're tethered to camera cables, and I just need to make sure that I can reach as far as I need to go for the quilt without damaging anything. Okay. Whoop, forgot I had constant speed on, you guys. Pays to look up first. So I often put channel locks on when I'm doing these edges. Today I'm not. This quilt is pretty square and flat, and I just eyeballed it. You can determine your own, level of eyeball comfortability. I'm pretty comfortable doing that. And I use things like, my leader rail and my front rail to gauge whether it's straight and square or not. But particularly when I'm working on lap quilts or baby quilts, I don't go to the trouble always of using the channel locks. They're a little bit more effort on the Bernina than they were on my Gamel. When I have my computer turned on, I don't today, but when I have it turned on, it aids things. There's almost like a power steering, but for the channel locks. So you can have them both on and still move around and quilt. It's just enough resistance to keep really straight lines. It's kind of cool, actually. But today I don't have the computer turned on. So then it means I have to trot around to the back of the machine and flip a lever. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm still not complaining. Channel locks in any form are a wonderful thing, a wonderful tool. So all I'm doing now is basting within a 1/4 inch of the edge of the quilt. This does not need to come undone later. It will all be hidden inside the line of the binding. To me, this is absolutely non-negotiable when setting up a quilt. This is what keeps it square. If you just launch right into quilting, it will. It's not may. It will pull up the fabric and pull it out of square. There's just no avoiding it. Fabric is flexible. It pulls. It moves. And so, to me, it's non-negotiable. So what I've done is basted up the left side, across the top, down the right, and now I will use magnetic bars to do the 4th side, which is my front. And then what I've got is a complete working surface that is squared up, ready to quilt, and will not shift. So again, I said I wasn't being painstaking about the channel locks and so forth today, and yet I'm pretty confident in saying, which camera am I on? I'm pretty confident in saying that it's within a 1/4 inch of square. Like, my machine wants to go in a straight line, right? It wants to go in a straight line. So if I'm gentle with it and I'm aware and I'm following my dead bar, it is all nice and straight. And now this cannot shift. The fabric layers cannot shift. They're held on all sides. And now we're ready to start quilting. So I am going to use a stitch length of 10. That's the default on the Bernina, and it's a good size. I'm going to get started and kind of get myself familiar and flowing in the pattern. It's one I've quilted lots of times before, the hibiscus. And once it's going smoothly, then I'm going to go ahead and go into manual mode, and I'll talk to you about that as I get into it. So I've pulled up my bobbin thread, I'm anchoring my stitches, and we are up and away. The little red lights that you're seeing are the stitch regulator on the Bernina. There's a little under the needle, 2 cameras. That's the 2 red lights. and they're watching the movement of the fabric. And I'm pausing because I actually did forget something. I do this so often when I'm talking. I need my side clamps on. So these are the red snapper side clamps that someone was asking about a moment ago. And I will come to the one closer to the camera, and you'll see that mine do open fairly easily. And that is only because I've done it so many times and they really do loosen up. So I'm just tucking one of those on each edge. Now on the far side, I had a selvage edge on part of that edge, edge of the backing, so it slid in really easily. On this end, I've got a torn edge on the fabric. So I've just got my corsage pin in my hand, and I'm just going to use it to guide the edge of that fabric right into the little groove. If you want to see that in more detail, I actually just a week or two ago released a tiny little YouTube episode on using the red snapper clamps, and I show that process. Okay, my side clamps are on. Now all my sides are stitched, secured, and there's just a little bit of tension on the whole quilt, so nothing will shift as I'm quilting. That's what I love to see. So as I'm quilting today, here's one of the big picture things to look for. Watch my movement across the quilt top as a whole. I move in kind of a diagonal fashion. So I started in a corner, and I will always fill in the area that's furthest away from me first, so that I never get the area that's close to me quilted and then sort of get myself painted into a corner. So you can see here, I'm quilting the bits that are furthest away from me quite a bit more than the bits that are close to me. And it's not an exact science. When I say diagonal, it's not an exact science by any means. This is a fairly big design, so it's going to be, you know, necessarily large sweeping repeats. But if you watch in the view that's got the big picture, you'll see that happening as I work my way across this pass. Let's talk about something else here for a second. I've got Stella anchored, so I can't exactly show you, but there is a limit to how far forward you can quilt, right, without hitting this rail, and that is different on different machines. Stella can go quite close to the front without bumping up, which is nice. But if you're newer to quilting and you don't have an eye for exactly where that is, or if you're working with a large motif as I am today, and it's hard to judge, can I fit in another repeat, or do I just need to go on and catch that in the next pass? This is a great way to deal with it. One of my favorite tools in the sewing room is my blue painter's tape. So when you basted, right, you came, or I did, I came right down as far as my machine would reach. So I know where that spot is. I can always drop a line of blue tape. I'll do it for this pass so you can see it. I can drop a line of blue painter's tape at that point, and it gives me a visual guide. Look at that, I made it way too short. It gives me a visual guide to know that's as far as I can quilt. So now, you know, I've got 4 inches in here, and now I can determine, can I fit another motif in, or can I just tuck a single petal in, or what do I need to do? But this just helps me without having to stop and think. it just gives me a really good visual guide. My eye can see that blue tape. I'm in business. And actually, let's pause for a sec, and we are going to stitch on manual mode. Try that speed. And you'll see I'm not quite stitching all the way to the blue tape. I don't want a straight line of flowers across the bottom. I'm just stitching as close as my, last motif would come. Here I'm pretty close to it. But it's helpful to know, right? To know exactly where my needle can land without bumping into anything, and I don't get any square corners on my petals that way. You might have another method. Some quilters run a bungee type cord, for example, across the front of their machine well, there's different reasons for doing that. If you want to keep track of actual seam lines and things like that, but you can also just stretch that across for seeing where the front edge is. If you have a long armor's tape measure, you could stretch that across the front. Just something that your eye can kind of see out of your peripheral vision that says, this far and no further. So what I'm stitching in now is called constant or manual speed. And the way that works is different machines have different terms for it, but you're setting the pace at which the needle moves before you start stitching. So it might be a percentage. In the case of my machine now, it's a stitches per minute number. I've got mine set at 1400, but that might be very different for you. And so what happens then is when I push start, the needle starts moving at that speed, and it is entirely up to me to control the stitch length with my movements. Why would you do that, you might ask, when you have a stitch regulator to do all that work for you? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is I love the smoothness of this. I love the sound of it. So if I'm quilting for several hours, this sound is much more restful to me. I'll switch back into the other mode and you can hear the difference. Ready? So this is now regulated, which means the machine, the motor, is going to adjust up or down, faster or slower, based on my movements. Right? So that's what those little red cameras are doing. And I'm exaggerating it a little bit. I could stitch more smoothly than that, but you hear that, right? It's constantly got that revving up and slowing down. So I find it much more restful to stitch in the manual mode. It also, I think, is very good for your quilting skills because it requires you to learn how to move smoothly, evenly and smoothly. And that inevitably produces good quilting. It really helps you gain control of your machine. Even a stitch regulator is not a magician. It will still get a little bit shorter stitches when you start up or slow down, or a little bit longer, as hard as it tries to adjust. You know, the fraction of a second is so tiny. And so this can really help with that. And it just feels so nice. A lot of quilters say that they can get smoother curves too with the stitch regulator off. It has just a tiny bit of drag because it's always making adjustments, right? So you kind of feel that in your stitching just a little. So if you've never tried this, you ought to at least give it a try. And certainly feel free to try it at a much slower speed, whatever feels comfortable for you. I always say if your curves are not smooth, they're kind of jerky, then you're probably going too slow to get a smooth curve. But if you're feeling like hurried and rushed, like someone's pushing you, then you've got the speed set too high. Just slow it down a little bit. When you find that sweet spot, you can just kind of get in the groove and relax and quilt. It's very lovely. So remember, if you have any questions, be typing them into the comments. Just put a big capital Q in front of them if you would, so that we can find them. And I'll stop between each pass to get a little sip of my juice and to answer any of your questions or comments that you have. And again, if you're enjoying this freestyling method of quilting and the tips that I'm offering, do hit that like button, the thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. And if you click on the bell as well, you will get notifications whenever I have a new episode or whenever I'm going live. So here again, you can see I'm about 2 inches, almost 2 inches away from my blue tape. But I feel like that would be very crowded to try and fit another, even a sideways petal in. So I'll just let that get caught in the next pass. In constant mode, it's not as easy to stop and pick up the stray threads. I just quilted one in. So I'll have to come back and pick that out a little later on. Let me know what you think of my thread choice. So it is, as I said, a little darker than the yellow, kind of solid. It has suns on it too, but it reads as a solid, so it's a little darker than that one, but quite a bit lighter than the brown. If I had had another shade, I might have gone even a little darker, but I didn't have another shade of this sort of gold, so picked the best one I had. I'm out of blue tape. Let's see if I can quilt without training wheels. again, can you see I'm approaching the edge of the quilt at the furthest edge from me much sooner than I am at the bottom. And I'm doing that on purpose. That's part of my casually diagonal movement across the quilt. That just helps me avoid quilting myself into a corner. It works really well for many freehand designs. And it just helps me make those decisions on the fly of where I should go next. You know, well, do I want to quilt another flower right here, or do I need another flower in those furthest areas first? In which case, that's where I'm going to angle up to. And these are all almost micro decisions that I make as I'm quilting, but it may help you to kind of know what my thought process is for deciding where do I go next. See, right here, I could put another flower that would go almost over to the edge of the quilt, but instead, I'm actually going to echo right up to that top corner and fill it in. Much easier to do it first, where I can see it all, than to fill in what's close to me first, and then have to come back and try and fill in that awkward corner. So, not right, not wrong, just easier. And now I'll just tuck little partial bits in here all the way down, filling up to the edge of the quilt, and that'll be pass number 1. I'm doing my petals quite shallow on this one because I can see my basting stitching, and I know I'm very near that front edge, and I certainly don't want to bump into it. And there we are. Okay. So now I'm kind of taking off all my holding apparatus, the side clamps, the front magnets. I'm going to take off the blue tape. Let's see if I can make a hole in one. Nope, didn't make it. To the trash can. And what I usually do is leave the needle down in my quilt, in the basting line, and go ahead and roll up the quilt and then just continue basting down that side. The only time I don't do that is if I'm quilting parallel lines, because it can distort the quilt just a tiny, tiny hair. So you need to be aware of that. So if you're doing something that's super, super precise, you might want to lift your needle and break thread. But for the purposes of this quilt, we're good. Okay, so what I've done, let me baste this side and then I'll show you with Stella out of the way so that you can see it. 1 second. I've done it so many times I do it almost without thinking about it, but it's worth mentioning how I kind of square up my quilt with each advance. Okay, let's move Stella a little bit. Woo! Make you guys dizzy. Sorry about that. So I've rolled my quilt up so I can see the next quilting area. I want to make sure, number 1, that my batting is smooth underneath. So I usually do it just by going along the front and pinching both fabric and batting and giving a little tug, and I can see that it's smooth. If you're not comfortable with that, you've got a floating top, so you can literally lift the top up and double check that it's all smooth. In my experience, if you don't do that, the tendency is for the batting to almost pull in and pull up a little harder in the middle, and all of a sudden you end up with this funny pleat in the middle that it's really hard to get rid of. So I think it's important with each advance of the quilt to make sure that is smoothed down. And then of course the quilt too. And so I'm actually fairly firmly with my hands pulling that quilt down over the front. I'm visually watching my long arm rail to see, is my seam line running straight? And I would say this side needs a little more tug on it. There we go. So now that I'm sure that's visually all squared, I have not measured. You certainly can. You can run your long armer's tape measure across and be really, really precise. I've not been that close, but again, I'm confident that I can get a quilt within a 1/4 inch of square, eyeballing it by this, just based on experience. So you do what your comfort level is. So I'm going to go back and baste the other side. So once again, we're going to have 4 secure sides on our quilt. Now right here, I can see this visually. I'm sure you probably can't on camera. There's a bit of a curve going on right here in this border seam. It is a little bit wider right here than it was up there. So I'm going to make that adjustment. I'm literally going to pull on the quilt until I see a nice straight line on that border edge. Then I'm going to go ahead and baste it, and then I'm going to distribute this fullness and quilt it in again so that I can achieve that square result of the quilt. Fabric is so flexible, so no matter how good of a piecer you are, you still have to manage this when you come to the long arm. If you don't do anything, even a perfectly flat and smooth quilt can stretch out of shape. So it's just really important that you watch for it. Okay, so here's my little bit of fullness. Let's put our clamps on the sides first. And I do get asked fairly often why I baste before I clamp. And the reason is, can we have the front camera for a sec, I think? The reason is, I feel like if I clamp the backing, okay, then it's got a bit of tension on it, and then I lay the batting and the quilt top. The batting and the quilt top have less tension, so the backing will necessarily be a little bit stretched, and I don't like that. So I prefer to have all my layers relaxed. I lay them in place, I get them smoothed out, I baste, and then I clamp, and then the whole thing has the same tension all the way across. I'm going to need my pin again for this torn edge. Once I get this all situated, we'll stop again for a few more questions. I'm having trouble with this one. Hang on a sec. There we go. And my tension on the sides is very gentle, very gentle. So now that I've got that side tension in place, now I'm just going to sweep this fullness so it's kind of distributed throughout. I don't want that whole pleat to be right here, and it's not very much, so you can't even tell by looking anymore that I have done that. But it's going to give me a nice square quilt, and it's all going to quilt in almost without effort, and it will be super nice. Okay, I'm going to throw the magnets up, and apparently there are some questions. Let's hear them. Or see them. And I'll wet my whistle again. My mother used to say that all the time. All right. B, I wonder if the pattern is a 3-yard quilt. Could be, but I don't know for sure. Michelle, I use the 10% code to purchase a ruler and decide to get more. Can I use the code again? The 10% code will apply to everything that's in my collection. There's about 8 rulers that have these types of handles that are in my collection. So the 10% off, you just have to enter it one time at checkout. It'll apply to everything in my collection. Janice, I'm unsure about the rulers. Do I have to buy the full group of rulers? Can I just purchase one? You can just purchase one. Absolutely. The collection just means those are the ones that are available for discount. Jan, have you tried pantograph quilting, and if so, do you recommend manual mode for it? I have not. I've only quilted a couple of pantographs in my whole quilting career, so I couldn't really speak to that. I'm sorry. Barbara, how do you keep your consistency so perfect? Mine start one size and then I end up different. They don't look overall the same size. Got a little tip for you, Barbara. Keep a drawing, so it can be your plexiglass design sheet. It can be a piece of paper. After you've quilted a few flowers, draw 1 or 2 on that paper. Keep it beside you at the long arm. Every time you advance the quilt, look back at it. That is true for so many of us, and we usually have a tendency one way or the other. I tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger as I go down the quilt and want to get done faster. Many people tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So having that diagram can just help you visualize it and check back with it. Okay, when I baste the quilt, it bunches slightly. What is your suggestion? Like the top of the quilt bunches slightly, the stitching bunches slightly? Clarify that a little bit for me. And Carrie, where did you find your 0 center tape measure and how did you attach it? Okay, is there another one, did you say, Dave, that goes with it? Okay. Mr. Producer is saying he has put a link in the comments for the tape measure. I found mine on Amazon. And I don't have it attached on this long arm. It doesn't have as convenient a rail as I had before. And I'll come back to that in a second. So on my Gamel, I had side rails that were just the right height. And I just looped the ends of my tape around it and I used office clips to pinch it, and then I could just adjust it as needed. On my Bernina, what I did, you can't see it sadly, I actually attached it on my dead bar. So I'm always looking at it. It's at the far end though, not at the end closest to me. So it still serves the same purpose. It's just at the quilted end, but it's in front of me all the time. Laura, did you have a video showing how to use the red snappers? Dave says he's put a link in the comments for you, Laura, and it was just a week or two ago. I did a little episode called Tool Tips, Red Snapper Side Clamps. Can't miss it. Carol, are you going to visit the Sisters Outdoor Quilt Show on July 8th? Yes, I am. I've never been, Carol, so I'm so excited about it. And you said you have 3 quilts showing this year. I will look for them. Carol, try and remember that. Hope to meet you there. Cheryl, do you have more room on the left and right sides when using the ruler base with the red snapper side clamps? The red snapper clamps are the slimmest I have found, both for width and for profile this way. So there always is something that your ruler base will, like every clamp has some that your ruler base will bump into. But the red snapper are the slimmest that I've found. One of the reasons that I like them. Margot, does it help loosen the side snappers if you leave them open when not on a quilt? I don't know, but I do always leave them open because why do you need to store them closed, right? It saves one opening. So mine always lay around open. And do you always quilt left to right? No, I don't, Anne. And you'll see in a moment, I actually always alternate because I feel like my flowers tend to be going in one direction. So I will alternate my next pass, and I pretty much always do that. When I'm freehanding, alternate the passes so it looks more randomized. Donna, when I'm quilting, I sing to myself and sometimes out loud. Keeps my rhythm even. Makes sense. It absolutely does. Singing can really help. And sometimes I find it helps. I love to listen to audible books, but to have my mind partially distracted, sometimes I quilt more smoothly if I'm not thinking about it too hard. Sometimes. It's worth a try. Kimberly. Late coming in, is there a link for the rulers? I missed the discussion about your ruler collection. There is a link for the rulers in the chat, right, Dave? Okay, Dave's going to try and find one. For sure, there is one, Kimberly, in my newsletter that went out yesterday. I wrote about it. Sorry, we're just conferring here, Dave and I. It's so hard to remember what each of us did. Pretty sure I put the rulers in the description below this episode. So if you don't know where that is, right below the picture, when you're not in full screen, you'll see it'll start describing what's in the show, and then it will have see more. And if you click on that see more, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've typed in there for you, and there is below pretty well every episode, including a link to the rulers. Janice, do you use a stitch regulator? Absolutely, sometimes I do. And I began this episode with it on, and I'll stitch again with it on for a few minutes. I go back and forth, and there's reasons for each one, for sure, if you have, access to both. Karen, how many hours a day do you usually quilt? Do your wrists or knees bother you? So first off, my wrists and knees don't bother me. But honestly, Karen, I don't quilt as many hours a day as I used to because I do a lot more teaching and online and conversing with students and things like that now. So now I don't actually quilt all that many hours a week, but I used to quilt about probably 20 to 25 hours a week, which is not a ton, but yeah. Mr. Producer's cracking jokes. He's a silly man. Okay, Jean, what is your go-to edge-to-edge for small piecing? Oh, I don't know if I have a go-to, Jean, but I tend to go smaller scale when it's small piecing because there are so many seam allowances that kind of stick up if you have a big sweeping design. So like filaments, which I did 2 weeks ago on the Lori Holt sampler on a live episode, that's one of my go-tos. Even this one, honestly, and you could make the flowers a little smaller and tighter, or all over feathers would be another one. And in case you don't know my all over feathers, I love quilting all over feathers, and also in the description of this episode, there's a link to my free class for quilting all over feathers. Firefly Dreams, do you prefer backing to be 108 inches wide for full coverage, or pieced? Are the pieced ones easier to quilt? Honestly, I don't have a strong preference. As long as the seams are reasonably flat and straight, I don't mind doing a pieced quilt, and obviously one that's not pieced is easy too, and I don't mind either way. I have some clients that do quite elaborately pieced backings, and I'm fine with that. Teresa, have you ever had to quilt a quilt larger than this on your frame? Oh yes, I've done king-size quilts on this frame. 108 inches wide I've done for sure. Oh, I'm sorry, larger than fits on your frame. My apologies. No, I haven't, because I can do a king size. I've not ever had anyone ask me to do larger. I have sometimes, turned the quilt to get the, width to be a little bit less, but no, I've never done one larger than would fit on my frame. I know there are people that do that, and I don't really understand how that works. Joan, thanks, Mr. Producer. When I've quilted this design, I ended up with a lot of motifs and only have room for 2 petals. I think I'm just starting too deep into the design. Can you suggest how to come out and make your initial swirl so that you can put 4 or 5 petals around it? Okay, I'll think about that, Joan. I think right off the bat, what comes to me is watch that you're not always quilting in a V. Maybe quilt a small one in there, but then have long edges of flowers and get that initial spiral out there in the open instead of always being in a little crevice and then only being able to fit 2 petals around it and then the next crevice. Does that make sense? That might help you a little bit. Don't be scared to stick it out there in the open. You can always fill in any little spaces with a bit of echoing. Jackie, what to do when quilted into a corner? Stop and break thread after the design? My go-to usually is echo, echo, echo. Stop and break thread or alter design. Echoing is usually my go-to, or, as I've been talking about with Joan, doing fewer petals, or even 1 petal, or even the center spiral, so kind of an element of the design often you can tuck in. I don't break thread when I'm quilting edge to edge. I just echo. If it comes down to it, I just echo my way out of the corner. Kathy, I like your choices. I find I'm so worried about my mistakes showing that my thread blends too much and you can't see the hard work I did quilting. Yeah, good point, actually. Good point. Be fearless. Teresa, how many hours a day do you quilt? Oh, we saw this. And how many days a week? I do something, Teresa, just about every day. I would say 6 days a week. I do something at my sewing machine or my quilting machine because it is my happy place. I don't quilt all that many hours a week anymore. I don't. And it depends too, because I quilt for clients. Sometimes I'll have a rush of them one week, right? And then only 1 or 2 quilts the next week. So it does depend. Okay, the top of my quilt does not stay straight and bunches. Okay, you were asking about bunching earlier. I'm going to suggest, Kay, that you look back at some other episodes. I show the loading in a lot of them, and particularly the most recent one I did, which was the Lori Holt sampler, had a little bit of excess fabric along the top, and I talked a bit about how to pull that in. There's another episode that's called the 2-inch minimizer. I know you ladies will all get that joke. And it had extreme wavy borders. And in that one, I went in depth into the various ways, kind of increasing measures that you can take to deal with fabric fullness on the edges. But I manage that as I go. I determine where I want the flatness to lay. I pin it if I need to, and then I pull it under the needle and get it stitched in there. Having some bunchiness show in your basting is not a problem. You can quilt that out. You want to control it in your basting, though. You don't want to put that basting perfectly smooth and then all of a sudden have pleats in excess that you can't deal with on your last pass. So watch the 2-inch minimizer and the Lori Holt sampler that I recently did. Both of those I know for a fact that I talk about basting and getting things even and square. Kim, starting my first applique project, any tips for quilting applique? I'm not great shakes at applique myself, Kim. But I don't know that it's a good topic for this time because I can't show you or demonstrate anything. But generally, applique is going to be more custom because generally you don't want to just quilt over it. You want to be outlining things and then filling in between them. So it's probably a good topic for another episode. Christina, what did you use to mount the tape measure on the dead bar? I used 3M double-sided tape, just the office variety. And I did it piece by piece by piece because it was really sticky. I didn't think I could manage the whole thing without wrangling it up. So I just did it bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And worked fine. And it's been on there for months without budging. Jan, Susan, where is the Sisters Quilt Show coming up? It's in Sisters, Oregon. That's the name of the town, is Sisters, Oregon. And it is a one-day outdoor quilt show. And it's world famous, and I've never been. And I'm going this year. So excited. Okay, let's get quilting. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I do alternate my passes. So the first one I started in the top right corner. This one I'm going to start on the left and move toward the right. Let's go back to regulated stitching for a little bit because one of you was asking about that. So I've got my stitch regulator on now. You're going to see two little red lights, which are the cameras that are viewing the movement of the fabric from underneath. That's how the machine knows how fast I'm moving and regulates. So when I have the stitch regulator on, the setting that I choose is how many stitches per inch I want it to try to achieve. And I've got my machine set at 10 right now. And I don't know if you saw me, I bumped up just a little bit against that top rail, but it was in the middle of a busy sunflower, and you notice I am not stopping and taking it out. It's pretty small, and I'm pretty confident in saying, if you don't tell, nobody's ever gonna know. The petals of my hibiscus flowers are more than an inch, probably close to 1.5 inches, and I've done this flower in different scales. I quite like the look of it larger, but it becomes difficult to fit it in. The larger your motif is, the more difficult it is to fit them into small spaces or to fill your entire pass up to the front. Hang on one second. My long arm is just a 1/4 inch bumping up against the frame. Where's my yardstick? I'm just bumping the side clamp just a touch, and I'll show you what I do about that. I have my trusty there we go, you can see me, my trusty yardstick. Any long straight edge will work, and I'm just sliding it underneath my clamp at the edge, and that just lifts my side clamp up just a tiny hair. And that's all I need, is that tiny hair of clearance. And I'm traveling all the way to the top because that just suits me in the way that I want to travel. And now I'm going to go back onto manual mode. I just want to fill up this area way up here before I come down into this one. I know it's difficult for you to see that. It's hard for me to follow what's on camera and what I'm doing. I do my best though. So I'm back on manual mode now. So this time what I choose on manual mode is the speed at which the needle moves. On my current machine, that is measured in stitches per minute. So I am at 1,400 stitches per minute right now. On some machines, it'll be a percentage of the total speed that the machine can go. So you might be seeing 20 or 30 or 50. Do whatever speed is comfortable for you. I do this quite a lot. So I find 1,400 or 1,500 very comfortable. You might not. And it also depends on the scale of what you're doing. If I was quilting little pebbles, I would not be going at this speed for sure. I'd have something much slower. But this is a fairly large scale design, so this works well. I'm keeping a weather eye out for where my basting stitches ended. so I know where the front of my machine is and the limit of how far I can stitch forward to the front. And I judge I can't get a whole petal on there, so I'm going to leave that one just as a spiral, showing that you can tuck in just an element of this motif to fill in an awkward corner. So while I stitch, because this is a little bit like watching paint dry, let me tell you a tiny bit of the story of why I created my YouTube channel, and specifically how these live and unscripted episodes evolved. So I have an online, on-demand class called the Freehand Quilting Masterclass, and in it I teach specific designs, including this one, and 25 or 30 others, step by step on black fabric with white thread so you can see every little detail. And that's all lovely. I've had a very great response to that, and I met lots and lots of quilting students through that. But what I found the first time that I ran that course already, what I found was that there was a limitation to what I could show in terms of applying those designs actually to a quilt. So it's one thing to know how to quilt a hibiscus. It's another thing to figure out how to travel around a quilt top, right? How to decide on the scale of the petals, etc., etc. So when I first started doing these episodes, I don't think I called them live and unscripted. I don't know what I called them. But that's kind of what I was doing them for, was to show my students, okay, here's what it looks like when you're working at a whole quilt. And here's how you make the decisions about where you go next and how you travel and those sorts of things. So it has kind of evolved over time. There has been a great response to it. Clearly, many quilters appreciate the opportunity to see that. And I just went forward knowing that I would have appreciated that way back in the day when I was at home long-arming by myself and, couldn't ever watch anybody do it. So I really hope that this is helpful for you. Some of you will be able to just figure out the design from here and, yay for you. Others of you may be interested in taking my masterclass, where I do break down this into a lot more detail and step-by-step instructions, how you move through the design, how I come up with designs, how I convert them from an idea in my head into something that is quiltable. All those things are included in the masterclass. So if you do want more information on it, you can find it on my website, which is stitchedbysusan.com. And there is a tab, I believe, for classes. I don't go to my website very often, you guys. I need to do that clearly more. Anyway, there's a link there that will take you to the masterclass, and it will tell you all of the modules that are included and break down in incredible detail what all is included in it. And the next class will be running late October. So during the month of October, I'll be doing some promotion for that, some free workshops and so forth. But if you're interested in it, when you're at that informational page, you can actually sign up for the wait list. And I always have some special bonuses for those who are on the wait list and purchase it down the road. So that's an option. If you are a more experienced quilter and perhaps don't want those 30 designs from A to Z, I also have a monthly membership, which just started not even a year ago. And again, there's been a really great response there. And it's subscription based. So you pay each month and then you have access to the whole thing. And each month I add some new content. So sometimes it'll be a new freehand design. Sometimes it has been guest teachers. Sometimes it's case studies, so a detailed look at a project and maybe steps that I took, decisions, any unusual features that it had, that sort of thing. All kinds of stuff. And it's growing and evolving. So those that are in it have given me feedback, and it has evolved a little bit based on that. And here you can see I've got a nifty little corner going on. And I'm just going to tuck in smaller petals, squishy petals, whatever it takes to fill in that little corner. The thing that I keep in mind is trying to keep a similar scale. So I know the size of my petal. I don't want to leave any unquilted areas that are bigger than that. And I can see looking forward that I'm actually going to bump my top rail again. I advanced a little bit too far, so I'm just winding the quilt back just a touch. Might need a little more yet. Gotta move my magnetic bars. One area where I obviously left an open spot at the bottom a little bit. Get this clamp off. Sometimes you do have to adjust as you go. Sometimes when you're not talking full speed, you can see those things as you're going. I wonder if I've gone far enough yet. I think I'm still going to go a little bit more. Okay, Mr. Producer is saying that there's a few of you that are repeatedly typing questions in because I'm not answering them as I go. If you wouldn't mind, I'll try and stop and take questions at each break, but I can't read them in between, and Mr. Producer has no way to relay them. So give me at least one break to try and get to them, and then if I don't, give us a reminder. How does that sound? So I was talking when I took that break a little bit about the scale of, making the decisions over whether you need to get into that awkward little corner or whether it's well enough left alone. That's kind of my measuring stick for it, is what are the largest spaces in my quilting design, and is this larger? Will it look like an awkward unquilted bit? So my petals in this design are the largest space, and they're, as I said earlier, 1.25 to 1.5 inches. So I'm not going to leave any 2-inch areas unquilted anywhere. That would really show up in the finished quilt. This hibiscus was a fairly early design that I developed, but for a couple of years I was doing it with much longer petals. I don't know what flower it would be like, almost like a zinnia. And at some point, quilting it out over and over and over, it dawned on me how much easier it is to fit it in with shorter, more plump petals. Somehow the long petals, you know, I liken them to a teenager's legs sprawling all over the couch. They're just difficult to control, where these shorter, chubbier petals are much easier. So those are the sorts of things that I try and keep an open mind to when I'm developing a design. You know, once I've thought of one and quilted it a couple times, it doesn't have to stay that way. If I can think of improvements that will make it more graceful or make it easier to travel. Sometimes these designs change over time. I don't think my initial one had an echo around it either, where you'll notice today I'm almost always echoing the petals, and I just think it gives a more finished look, and it kind of sets each flower a little more separate from the flower next to it. So that was another change that evolved over time. And we just ran out of bobbin thread. I've been sitting here thinking, it's got to be close, it's got to be close. Maybe I can make it to the end of this pass, but I didn't quite. Okay, I choose not to try to regulate my bobbin thread, like how much is left, because it's never an exact science. I choose to just let mine run out. So what happens then is the last couple inches did not have good tension on them. So what you're seeing me do here is undo a few inches. And since I have to do that, I usually go back to a corner, a nice point. It makes it more unobtrusive. It doesn't show up as much. And also at points, especially because I'm stitching in constant mode, there's always a few stitches there. So that helps to anchor it because I'm going to undo and then I'm going to clip my threads. And then when I start up again, I'll overlap, about a 1/4 inch of stitching. So I'm backing up almost to the point. And so when I come back to start, I'll start stitching right at the point, and that will overlap the stitching a little bit, anchoring it a little bit. I've already got a bobbin full, so we're good to go. And I'm not moving very far, but usually I drop my blue seam ripper right where the thread break is, because it can be very difficult to find on a printed quilt otherwise. One of the things that I kind of took to heart over all my issues with thread tension is that I much more often actually use my TOA gauge and check my bobbin tension. I don't think the TOA gauge is absolutely essential. I know lots of quilters. I was one of them for a long time that didn't have one and just did, you know, the kind of drop feel. But since I do have one, it came with my machine, they are really helpful. Gosh, I've got contacts in today and they're just not very clear somehow. Trying to adjust the screw just a touch. Perfect. So I stitch right at about 200 for my machine, and I'm also seeing that it's, when I pull on it, it's feeding smoothly. So I've got a needle gauge. Yeah, you guys can see me. I've got a needle gauge and I don't want it to be wobbling. That will often mean sometimes the very last few rounds of the bobbin, it's not feeding smoothly. So I pull until that is pulling smoothly off the bobbin, if that all makes sense. So that's one of the things I like about the gauge, is it tells you that. You can't tell that with the drop method, I don't think. setting the gauge flat is also helpful. So see there, I learned something from all those thread breakage issues. It saves time in the long run to just check the bobbin tension. We'll see how long that good habit lasts. Okay. So I'm almost to the end of this pass, and then we'll take some more questions. So if you have any, now's a great time to be typing them in. I've pulled up the bobbin thread, and I'm going to take a couple of very close, very tightly spaced stitches that are overlapping my last stitching. I'm leaving the tails in place for just a moment. I'm going to end up stitching over them once. Like that, and then I will pause and snip the tails. Have we got a close-up camera on? We do. So here's my join, is at this little point. If I snip that tiny thread tail, you could not find that in a month of Sundays. So that to me is a great way to join on an edge-to-edge design. And there we are. Okay, I will take off all the clamps. Stella is out of the way this time, so I will leave her needle down, and we'll take some questions. All this apparatus. It's all got a purpose, though. Okay, I'm ready. Ah, that's great coffee. My mic keeps running up right into my cheek. Okay. Michelle, I had a hard time identifying from the photographs which specific rulers are in your collection. Would it be possible to provide a list of names and sizes of your ruler collection? Okay, I'll think about an easy way to do that. Thanks for that point. Good to know. Donna, another episode for quilting applique would be wonderful. I will seriously consider that, Donna. I don't get a lot of applique quilts in because edge-to-edge work is what I love. That's kind of the clientele that I have amassed. But I'll certainly keep my eyes open for that. Teresa, you mentioned to take off the stitch regulator to do circles. What stitch length do you recommend? Okay, so if the stitch regulator is on, you're choosing the stitch length. And I would go smaller if they're small pebbles like 14 or 15. If the stitch regulator is off, then you're choosing speed. And that just depends on you. That just depends on you. I can't really give you a number. But if you're feeling pushed, it's going too fast. That's all I can say. Dolly, will you be in the Bernina booth at the Houston Quilt Show in early November, having fun learning feathers in your free class and looking forward to the next master class? I believe I will be at the Houston Quilt Show in the Bernina booth. Yes, I'm not 100% sure, but about 90. Kate, do you have any advice on how to maintain a nice smooth echo on a design without drifting too far off? I don't know if I have great advice, Kate, but I will say this. I often say about edge-to-edge quilting like this, you can practice the skills you need for high-end custom quilting, and echoing is a great example of that. Developing your eye for visualizing echoing comes with practice, but the better at it you get, the more you can use that in your custom quilting projects. If I was going to recommend anything, it might be try different hopper feet on your machine if you have them. So a hopper foot that's exactly a 1/4 inch around the needle can help you to visualize what a 1/4 inch is and therefore what a 1/2 inch is. On the Bernina, we have the option of some little snap-on accessories to the feet, like to the 72S foot, for example, that are literally called Echo Quilt Clips. And you can get a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch and so forth. And that can give you a visual guide. So you might give that a try. Donna, I'll send you mine. That's the applique. Ken, I can send you this applique quilt I'm starting. Well, you guys, I'm not opposed to it. In the last 6 months or so, I've done fewer and fewer custom quilts just because I do so many of these live episodes now that fitting them in between and having my long arm available on Friday morning when I'm ready to go is a bit tricky. So you're free to email me and I will definitely have a discussion with you, but I'm probably not going to take on any 30 or 40 hour projects. I can tell you that now. Lynn, do you have a method for storing your magnets when not in use? Oh, I have a fancy method for that, Lynn. I've got a fatigue mat at the back of my machine that bumps right up against my wall, and it creates a crevice with the baseboard, you know, just kind of a little valley in there, and my magnets all line up in that valley. It's enough of a valley that I don't stub my toe on them, which is lovely. But before I had a fatigue mat, they just went right up against the baseboard. You do not want to stub your toe on them. Linda, how do you determine what you will charge for your quilting services? Oh gosh, this is a bigger question than I can look at today too in depth. This is a good podcast episode, Linda. But basically, I kind of reverse engineered it to what do I want to be earning an hour? And how many hours does it take me to do this quilt? And after you've done some and timed them, you get a pretty good estimate. And therefore, what do I need to charge per square inch to achieve my hourly rate? Or you could just bill by the hour, I suppose. But that's how I did it. I looked at what do I feel like I want to earn per hour and reverse engineered that to what I then needed to charge. Be sure to include things like consultation, billing time, prep time, trimming time if you do it. All those things include in your time. Savannah, I find it amazing that you can quilt and speak coherently. Haha. That comes with practice, and if you've watched enough of these episodes, you've seen me trip a few times, either over my tongue or over my quilting, one or the other. Sandy, another question about putting the zero tape on the leveling bar. Do you wrap it around the bar in sections or tape horizontally in sections? It's not wrapped around the bar anywhere. It is, at the end of this episode, I'm going to bring a roving camera over here and pan over the quilt. I'll try and remember to show that tape at the same time. It is just flat and smooth along the bar. And it's longer than my frame actually is. I snipped off both ends. I just literally custom fitted it to my dead rail along the back, is what I did. Elaine, do you take your ruler base off when not using rulers? I personally do, Elaine. It's not that you have to, but it does, it limits your space at the front of your machine a little bit, like how close you can come to the front. And because I mostly do edge-to-edge quilting, I want that space. So I take the ruler base off between times. Silly Sally, what is your upper tension when you use isocord? Right now, I've got my upper tension at 3.5, and isocord's default is 4, so I've lowered it just a touch. I don't know that my machine will translate to your machine at all. I would certainly start with their default and go there. Okay, Kelly, do you have any advice on how to maintain a nice smooth echo on the design? Oh, we had this one already, huh? Okay. That's it for questions? Yay! Okay. Let us advance. Mr. Producer found one more. I can't do the rest all in one pass, so I'm going to err a little less so that I don't have to quilt at arm's length quite as much, since I have to do 2 more advances. Anyway, one more question, Margaret. Do you base the whole quilt before you start? No, I don't, Margaret. This front is floating, and so is the batting. So what I'm doing now is doing the advance, and I'm going to baste both sides, and I'm going to put my magnetic bars on the front, thus securing the whole thing. But this little end will still be floating until I get to the very last pass. So again, I've done my method of pinching and pulling. Pinch the batting too. Tug, tug, tug. It's all smooth. I'm visually gauging my seam lines against the rollers of my machine. I'm visually looking at the seam lines of the borders. In every way that I can think of, I'm checking that this is straight and square. And I do, of course, have my tape measure at the back. So as the quilt is rolling up, I am seeing those measurements. So again, as with the last pass, there is a little bit of curvature going on this right-hand side. So again, I'm just going to, with my nails, pull that in till my edge is straight, till my border seams are running straight, and I'll quilt that little bit of fullness in as I go. We're on basting mode. Here we go. You're seeing just a little bit here of me adjusting the fabric. I do find if you don't do anything, even if your quilt is perfectly smooth, the action of your hopper foot will push the edge of the quilt forward in front of you. So I almost always put a little bit of tension in some way on at the back. And if I need to, I actually grasp the edge of the fabric and pull it. So I'm pulling it under the needle. It's not drastic, but it's just a little bit faster than it would otherwise go. And it's enough to manage that little tiny bit of fullness. There's different ways to do that. I know lots of quilters who quilt, who start at the bottom and go to the top with their basting, because that helps them, keep it under control. They can see how much fullness to put in there. I choose to just get my fabric all in place, pin it if necessary, know where it needs to be, and then stitch it in place. There's different ways to approach that. I was recently in a quilting shop. We're lucky enough to have a long arm quilting shop fairly near to where I live. And they have a number of machines in there that they rent. And so I was recently in there, and of course I'm Snoopy, so I'm wandering around watching various people quilting at the machines. And of the 5 machines, 2 of them had edge-to-edge type quilting like this, and in neither case were they basted. And it just astonishes me to watch that. It just astonishes me because your quilt pulls all askew. I just do not see how you can avoid it. And I tried not to be the uber nosy, the uber nosy quilter who wanted to lean over their shoulders and say, it would really work well if you do this and this and this. So I didn't. I was a good girl. But I wanted to. I'll just be honest. Okay. All right, so I've got my side clamps on. So again, a little less than last time, but I still have this little bit of fullness in the middle. I'm just gonna brush over it and kind of distribute it around. That will easy peasy get taken up in the petals of the flowers. Nobody will be any the wiser. Clamps, pin. Okay, last time we started on the left, this time we're starting on the right. I clamped my thread tail in. Manual mode. I just changed the bobbin thread. I'm trying to think of all the things before I start stitching. This bobbin now should see us through to the end. Thread tails at the edge, I just trim off when I trim the quilt, which I do for my clients as a rule. After I'm done quilting, I trim all the edges for them. We must have at least one business quilter here because you were asking about how you determine what to charge for a quilt. So let's talk about services for a second. I took a class some years ago from a kind of pioneer is not the word, but a matriarch maybe of the machine quilting world, Georgia Stull, and she called it Minding Your Business. And it was all about business-related topics, and I got some great ideas from her in terms of customer service. And then, of course, it got my mind thinking to what that might look like for me. And so for each of you, this will be a very individual thing. But trimming up a quilt is not something I would say that long armors typically do. Certainly before I was a long armor and I sent my quilts out, they always came back with, all the fabric and batting still attached to them, just in a big lump, and it was up to me to clean that up. But I seem to quilt for quite a high percentage of elderly ladies who either, cannot manhandle a big quilt with their shoulders or don't have space for a big quilt to trim it up. So that is a service I started offering early on, and now I offer it to anyone who wants it. And I keep a large table. I have an extra room just off my quilting room. I'm very fortunate that way. It's an ugly concrete room, but it is a room. And I have a big table set up in there, and I just leave it set up with a big cutting mat and a long ruler and a larger rotary cutter. So that's a service that I offer, and I don't charge for it. If you wish, I will trim your quilt to a 1/4 inch, and it just takes me minutes, right? Because I'm all together set up. But they're so grateful because it saves them an hour or more. So, all that to say, if you are thinking of starting a business, is there something you could offer your customers that you can promote, that you can talk up, that makes you special, that makes them feel special even? Okay, I bet you guys are laughing at me because in all that talking, do you see what I did? I quilted a row right across the quilt. And you know what? No biggie. I'm just going to quilt back and finish filling it in. Maybe I'll echo back. Get in control of this. So clearly I have demonstrated for you. Even if you don't do it right the first time, it does not matter. Now we're back on track. And because I know the next pass is so tiny, I'm not going to worry about quilting really near to the front. In some ways, it'll be easier not to have just a skinny 6-inch space to quilt. So I'll go ahead and leave some for that last pass, a little bit of room to maneuver, if you will. This show, as I mentioned earlier, being YouTube, is always free for you to watch. But we do have an option for contributing to the show if you wish, and that is at buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. And we set up that fund because early on we knew we needed some more camera equipment, and we didn't really know how to do that on our own. And we have been so appreciative of the response. So many of you have contributed. The donations can be as little as $5 one time, or if you wish, you could sign up to contribute monthly. But every dollar that comes in there, we invest in further, equipment, lighting, cameras, etc. So to those of you who have contributed, thank you. We appreciate it so much. And if you're liking what you see, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, even hit the bell, then you'll be notified whenever I've got a new episode coming out. And if you heard that little rattle, that was a fairly thick seam allowance. And I should have, I didn't really see it coming. If I had seen it coming, I would have actually gotten out of constant mode and gone a little slower over it, because that's never an ideal. But we escaped. No broken needle. I talked just a little bit earlier about my monthly membership, and it is called Advance. Just kind of a play on words, because we advance our quilts every time we quilt one pass. And also it's just a way of advancing your quilting skills, expanding them, adding to them. But I do have a really fun one coming up in August. A colleague, Carly Porter, some of you may know her. She's the inventor of graffiti quilting, and she is an extremely creative artist and quilter. And she's written some books. She has some online classes too. Anyway, I've got an episode coming from Carly, which will come out as part of the August new content, and it's part quilt show and part graffiti quilting lesson. And it's a long one. She was very generous with her time, bless her heart. So that is something really fun to look forward to in August. So if you were thinking about joining, that may be a good time to do it. And I'll underline again, when you do join, you get all the content that is in the whole thing, all there at once at your fingertips, not only what comes out at the time that you join. So it's a good deal. Anyway, Carly Porter coming your way in August. I'm pausing just a moment to check camera cords. Dave, can you have a look again? Because I was feeling it about 4 inches earlier this time. Okay, we're all set. I just didn't want to yank anything out of place when I got over there. As you might imagine, this is a bit of a challenge to operate a 12.5-foot machine with cables and etc. running here and there, and not bump into them and have a half decent view. So I appreciate your patience on the days that we've struggled with it, and I appreciate your feedback whenever we land on something good. It's encouraging to know that. Making some little petals there. And here we are. So one more small pass left. Again, tugging on my batting just a little bit. Make sure it's smooth under there. Tugging on my quilt top. Making sure the lines are straight and smooth. Looking good. Looking good. Okay, let's do that final baste. And again, you see I'm tugging on the fabric that's behind the needle where I've already stitched, just to encourage it to go under the needle a tiny touch faster than it might otherwise. I don't want it to be pushing forward in front of the hopper foot. If you have not done a lot of quilts, you might be much more comfortable pinning this whole front edge in place. I did that for a long time. Whatever your comfort level is, that's what you should do. At this point, I'm pretty comfortable eyeballing these things and quilting them into place. But if you're more comfortable dropping in 4 pins or 16 pins or 20, do it. And I do know my basting line is not perfectly straight, but again, I've got it well within the seam allowance of the binding, so nobody's ever going to know. I do have the Q-matic system on my Bernina, so when I have that turned on, I can lock both my channel locks into place, vertical and horizontal, and it has a almost a power steering feeling feature, so you can move it still when the channel locks are on. There's just resistance, so it's kind of a cool feature. When I've got that turned on, I just pop both the channel locks on and proceed with my basting, and there's enough resistance that it holds a straight line, but I can still move it around. But I don't have the computer turned on today. So I opted not to use the channel locks. They're fairly simple. It's just a lever that you flip for each one, but it does still involve walking to the other side of the quilting frame to do it. I'll just get my clamps all in place, and then we'll do a couple of questions, and we'll start quilting on the left this time. I probably should leave Stella out of the way then, shouldn't I? Did I tell you that my long arm's name is Stella? Many of you are longtime viewers and knew that. I don't know, I have a thing about naming my machines. They just have so much personality, and that just adds to the personality, I feel like. Also, we're partners. We're very much partners in this business. Okay, let's go. Questions. There we are. Sorry about the big pause. Donna, how often do you add new content to Advance? I'm registered. I do it once a month, and there's 2 pieces. And it's usually at the beginning of the month. Sometimes for various reasons, one of them has been delayed, but there's 2 new pieces each month. And I always send out a letter telling you what they are and exactly where they can be found so they don't get lost in the sea. And during a break, could you talk about how Stella's recent thread breakage problems were resolved? Thanks. I will briefly. There were a few little factors. There often is so many factors, right, that contribute. But the main factor, which I think was at the root of it, I took my machine in for a full-fledged servicing. It was at several million stitches, so it wasn't a bad thing. It's kind of like having your, getting new tires on your car, and then you go in and have them retorqued, just a couple weeks in, just to set everything right. So my service technician kind of likened it to that. He's like, you need this servicing early on, and then you should be good to go for a long time. So fingers crossed. But the one thing he found was that the needle bar was ever so slightly off center. So of course that would affect the stitch formation, right, as the needle is going past the hook. So that eliminated 95% of the problem right there. So that was the single largest factor. Silly Sally, do you use the default speed when winding isocord on the bobbin, or do you adjust? I actually did adjust it to 50, also at the advice of a technician, because the isocord is a bit slippery thread. He suggested that I slow it down. I forget even what the default is. I think it's high 60s. So I do it a little slower, and it's not an issue because it just winds while I'm stitching, so it doesn't really matter. So that, again, a little factor that might have had 2% of effect. I don't know what the percentage was, but all these little things, right, that help, having a bobbin that's wound smoothly and accurately, etc. So I did slow it down to 50. Joan, actually an answer. I recently started offering trimming as an additional cost service. I also offer making and machine sewing on binding. A while ago, I added labeling as a service. My latest offering is washing and drying the finished quilt. I didn't quite finish that all, but I can see that, Jonah. Those are some really great thoughts. And I didn't elaborate on that too far, but you know your clientele. But binding is a great example. There are lots of quilters that hate applying binding, and I offer that as a service too. And what I did is I really figured out a system for binding at my sewing machine that I can do it fast. You also can apply binding on the long arm. Again, you need to practice to get fast at it. But if that's something your clients want and it's a service you can offer, it can really be a good selling point, a good feature, a reason to make people come to you. So those are really good ideas, Joan. Linda, what kind of surge protection do you have on your long arm? It has a built-in, what's it called, David? CPU? Yeah. A circuit breaker is built in. That's right. And I know that it works because we have recently had 2 major power outages with flickers and that sort of thing, and I had no problems at all. So I did not add a fancy one. I have the one that's built in to my machine. on my gammal, I did have a box, one that I purchased, and I think it's probably a well-spent $100. Katie, for someone disabled looking for low vibration in the handles and really smooth quilting, do you recommend the gammal or the Bernina? The Bernina. The gammal is definitely a more industrial machine. It actually does stitch at higher speeds, but that is one of the trade-offs. You do get more of that vibration and noise as well. Michelle, what basting length do you use? I've got it currently set on 4 stitches per inch, so that would be a 1/4 inch. I have the option of 1/2 inch or 1 inch too. I can't get the 1/2 inch to turn a good corner, so that's why I like the 1/4. Silly reason, but true. Joan, what is graffiti quilting? I can't imagine getting a slab of concrete under my machine foot. True story. So look up Carly Porter or look up graffiti quilting. Carly is spelled Karlee, but basically it's a mishmash of designs. But Carly is super artistic and it is super gorgeous. You'll love it. She's a really cool lady. Okay, let's get back at quilting. Last pass, people. Back into manual mode. For the lady who was asking about working with a disability and finding a machine that has low vibration, I strongly recommend either A, going into a local dealership if you have one near you, you could get more time there, or trying out quilt machines at a quilt show. You can find every brand at most shows. It seems like you might not be able to like quilt a whole baby quilt, where if you went into your dealer, you know, it might be that they would let you quilt, you know, one whole pass on their sample that's loaded or something like that, so that you can get, you know, a solid 5 or 10 minute feel for it, if that makes sense. So I'm currently stitching in manual mode or constant. Both mean the same thing. They mean that the setting I chooses a constant speed for the movement of the needle. And I, as the quilter, am entirely in charge of the stitch length based on how fast I move the machine. Contrast that with the regulated stitching mode, which is where there is some way of the machine reading how fast you're moving across the fabric, and the motor speeds up and slows down to adjust to the speed of your movement. And in that case, you set the desired stitch length, and the machine tries to achieve that by speeding up and slowing down. Both have their place. They absolutely have their place. Stitching in constant, I would say, takes more practice. It feels smoother. It's more rhythmic to quilt. I think it ups your skill level and your control at your machine. But it is something else to think about until you get comfortable with it. So when I'm, for example, trying out a new design or working on something that's fiddly, like it's got super bulky seam allowances and I have to be careful or slow down here and there, that's when I use that regulated mode. It's a really great tool. And it's kind of like a training wheel. If you're, if you are working on a new design and you have to think more about where to travel next or how to fit things in, it's a great tool to have if it's available to you. Also a really great tool when you're stitching with rulers. I do know some quilters who do not have stitch regulation and still do beautiful ruler work. But that is definitely, that is very skillful. I personally always use my stitch regulator when I'm working at a ruler. But that's just me. On this very last pass, I'm getting a lot more of the 1 and 2 petal flowers, or maybe the single petal or the single little swirl tucked in, because of course I'm dealing with a fairly large repeating motif and a fairly small space to tuck it in. But it turns out looking absolutely fine as long as you keep in mind the rule of thumb of what your spacing is. So for my petals being 1.5 inches in size, I'll try not to leave any unquilted spaces that are any larger than 1.5 inches. So I tuck something into every one of those spaces. I try, it doesn't always work out well, but I try not to repeat the same thing one after another along that outer edge of the quilt. So at the very least, I try to alternate, either flower or plume, or which direction they're facing, or in some way make them different. This design, it's fairly easy to do it on some others. They tend to want to fall in a tight little row at the edge of the quilt, and I'm trying to avoid that as best I can. And I see that I'm running into the area that's closest to me having more quilting than what's further away from me. But I know that, and I'm kind of watching that in my peripheral vision. I know I've got to get back into that corner I left unquilted up there. So I've chosen to just quilt motifs to get up there. I could also have chosen to just echo, echo, echo until I got there and then fill it in. Either way works. Let's echo, show you how that's done. Just like that, to get right back up to the top of it and fill it in. Echoing is your friend. I know you probably can't even see what I'm quilting on the busy sunflowers. But there was a funky little space up there that I filled. And again, I've left a space, so I'm just going to echo back right now and just fill that in. So I'm just talking through this because I think it helps you to know there's not a right and a wrong way to do even that. I'm going to swirl out here and put a swirl in that one little corner that's up there and just leave it as a swirl. There's no right or wrong way. It's whatever is complementary to what you're quilting. So similar spacing as I mentioned. If you've got swirls, don't tuck in a box, right? Tuck in a swirl. So something that's complementary. If you're quilting a flower, it's pretty easy. You can just tuck in 1 or 2 lonely petals. But as long as it looks complementary and relatively consistent for spacing, it will all look good in the end. I hope today's quilting has been a great example of the time savings feature of doing this type of work freehand. You know, some of you I know are already converts, but some of you might not yet be, so I'm going to talk to you about it. When you do either a pantograph or a digital design, I have not done much pantograph work, but I've done some digital. There's a fair bit of setup time involved. You know, the lookers on like to say, oh, you just push a button and it quilts, but it is not that easy. There's measuring, there's repeats, you know, there's fitting one pass of the quilting to the next pass. There's all kinds of things, and they're all critical to it looking good. What I absolutely love about quilting freehand like this is you can pretty much just load up the quilt. You saw me doing it today from start to finish. Load up the quilt and start stitching, and you just fit things in as you go. You don't have to worry about the size of your quilt specifically, because you don't have any borders or any you know, edges that you can't quilt beyond, etc. It's just so easy, and that is one of the things I love about quilting freehand. So I've chosen to purchase the digital component on my current long arm, and I'm learning how to use it only because I want to expand my skill level. But I don't think you'll ever talk me out of loving this first. This is my first love. It's so fast. It can be whatever you want it to be. You can stylize it. You can change it up just with your creative brain. You don't have to program anything in or resize it or anything like that. I just love it. I love the freedom that it offers. And I absolutely love showing quilters that anybody can do it. It's not mysterious and it's not magical. There's a fairly step-by-step process to learning it, and then there's practice. And anybody that wants to can absolutely do it. And here we have a number of little corners, and I'm just going to keep proceeding with my single petals and or swirls until I don't see any empty unquilted bits, and then we'll call it done. Wow, we did it! It feels a bit miraculous to not have any thread break at all, which really is the norm, but has not been my norm for quite a while. I'm so pleased. Okay, so we are going to try and set up a roaming camera so that I can pan across this. Okay. So bear with us. I've got the camera in my hand now. Mr. Producer's got to change which camera you're looking at. And I'll pan across this so you can get a look at it. Don't forget to have a look at the rail on the rail. That's not what I'm trying to say. There, you can see my measuring tape at the back. Okay, so I'm just going to pan across so you can get a nice little look. I'll get the edge right in it. There's the edge, so you can kind of see how they fit in there. Just a little of this and a little of that. That is our sunflower quilt. I'm so pleased. Lovely. Okay, any last questions? Let me get a little of my magic elixir again. So delicious, by the way. Michelle, do you leave your basting stitches in the finished quilt? Thanks. Beautiful FMQ as always, Susan. Thanks, Michelle. I do leave the basting stitches in. I'm careful to keep them well within the 1/4 inch seam allowance, so when the binding is put on, they'll be totally hidden and stay in there. It also stabilizes that outer edge, so there's no reason not to. Kim, is the quilt behind you done with rulers or is it freehand? It is freehand. I call that design Crazy Eights. It's another one that is in the Freehand Quilting Masterclass. One of my favorites. Pam, will you be at any quilt shows near Kansas other than the Houston Quilt Show? I don't know of any so far. Pam, I know that Bernina is working on scheduling right now for 2024, but I have not heard back on that yet, so I go where they say. Angela, as a beginner working without a stitch regulator, what are the best and easiest designs to start with? Something curvy, Angela, so loops, even double loops, and then you can experiment with, littler loops and larger loops. Not having corners will help you, and it just really focus on moving smoothly rather than swooping, right? It'll be really good for you. You will never be sorry you invested the time into learning that skill, in my opinion. Jackie, thanks. Seeing you maneuver is what I need to embed in my head to get more graceful in my quilting, unless you would like to come stand over me with the ruler to keep me from bad habits. That is always an option. Yes, and that is my hope, that kind of see the bigger picture, while not instructional in terms of the actual quilting, just helps you to see what it all looks like, how it all comes together. Teresa, do you ever use the cruise mode? I tend to gravitate towards that. However, I do like manual as well. I go back and forth a little bit between the cruise, and that just means, for those of you that aren't familiar, Bernina and some other brands have this type of thing where even when you're not moving, the needle keeps going at a slow rate, and then it stitches, and then it just kind of bobs and cruises whenever you're pausing. Certainly there are places for that. I do not use that when I'm stitching with the ruler, but lots of times when I'm doing free motion work like this, I do. Yeah. Donna, is that a regular measurement tape? Well, there is a link in the comments for it. It's 0 in the middle and goes out to both ends, and it's really long. It comes about 14 feet long. So it is a specialty tape. Yes, we did that one. Paula, I'll never be able to afford a long arm machine, but I love watching you work on the quilts I'm starting. Learn to quilt on my Juki 2010. That's really great. That is a great place to start. Don't throw the idea out, though. There are used machines all the time that are available. You might be surprised. So don't throw the idea out altogether. This would be Dave. So far, no one has stumped the teacher. No bonus points yet. Too funny. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. So once again, if you've enjoyed this episode, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. I didn't mention earlier, but I should now. Sometime today, maybe even while we've been on air, I am actually going to hit the milestone of 10,000 subscribers. So thank you to all of you that tune in and make these live and unscripted episodes so much fun. You're so gracious when things go wrong. You're so encouraging, and we have so much fun together when things go right. So thank you very, very much for watching. Mr. Producer's looking. We're at 9996. Come on, you guys. Surely there are 4 of you that can hit that subscribe button, isn't there? Anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget that I do have the podcast Measure Twice, Cut Once if you're looking for some easy listening. Some of them are me on my own, but most of them are interviews with other quilters and crafters, and just some great conversations about what crafting and creating means to us, mostly quilters. So podcast.stitchedbysusan.com is where you'll find that. Information on my website regarding the Freehand Quilting Masterclass, which I've talked about a couple of times. A huge portfolio of designs and a lot of theory about these sorts of decisions too, to get you over feeling scared and terrified and afraid of wrecking your quilt, and into feeling confident about those things. So that's on my website, stitchedbysusan.com. And I'm across all the social media as Stitched by Susan. And in the next couple of days, I'll try and get some good photographs of this quilt and post them on social media so you can come back and look at them if you choose to. So once again, thanks a lot for tuning in. It has been a real pleasure to sew with you today, and I will see you next time.